Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us in the evening tonight to talk about reconciliation projects and how we can get them started. I'm doing this webinar on my own today, so I'll be slowly admitting people as they filter in while also trying to present, so just bear with me if it seems a bit clunky. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of the webinar today, I would like to acknowledge that the land that I'm presenting the webinar from today is the land of the Kaurna people. Pay my respects to elders past and present who hold such a deep connection to this land, and pay my respects and my gratitude for being able to do this incredible work on Kaurna country every day. If you want to share which country you're joining us from today as well in the chat box, we really welcome it. I'd love to hear where everybody's joining us from. And you can use that chat box throughout the session today to ask any questions. We'll have 15 minutes at the end where we can really talk through some potential challenges or things that maybe you'd like a little bit more information about. So you can also hold on to any questions that you might have for the end of the session today. In the meantime, though, I just will ask that you keep your videos and your sound off. The webinar is being recorded, so if you pop your video on, you might be in the recording when it goes up on YouTube later, so just keep that in mind. And same with any questions. So if you do have a question, there's the raise your hand function, or you can pop it straight in the chat and I'll get to it when I can. And yeah, as I said, at about 5:45, we'll have some time to go through questions in a bit more detail. So thank you. Thanks everybody for joining tonight. So we're going to go through reconciliation projects and engaging in reconciliation in meaningful ways. So there's a couple of things that we're going to go through tonight. The first is developing a meaningful reconciliation project in your site, and the purpose and the reason for putting together a really interesting project that you can then use to apply for grant applications. And then at the end of the webinar, I will share about Reconciliation SA's own grant program and how you might be able to then utilise some of the things you've learned today to develop an application, especially for that program. But we wanted to do it in two parts because our grants are limited. And so as a result, like a lot of people do miss out, unfortunately. We had an incredible large number of applicants last year, and we can only give away a small amount. We don't have enough money to give everybody a project. And so this will help you to have, I guess, a project plan and something ready to go if your local council starts, offering grants. If there are grants through either, your own workplaces, if you see something online, if there are philanthropic grants or anything that you think your site might be worth kind of engaging in, to have a look at that as well. So but I think before we kind of get into what a reconciliation project might look like and how we can engage in reconciliation projects, it's really important that we also look at what reconciliation is and what we're talking about when we're talking about a reconciliation project. So for those of you who've maybe attended one of my webinars before, you'll know that we often talk about the 5 dimensions of reconciliation. And I think before we get started into what reconciliation projects will look like, it's good to kind of just revisit these, particularly in line with developing any kind of project plan. So the 5 dimensions of reconciliation first came about in 2016 through a report called the State of Reconciliation in Australia report. There's since been another one in 2021. And that report is exactly what it says. It's a snapshot in time that really lets us know what the state of affairs when it comes to reconciliation is in Australia at this point in time. In 2016, they did a lot of consultation within Australia and outside of Australia, and they came out with these 5 dimensions, and these are 5 interrelated, interwoven dimensions on, I guess, how we're going to achieve reconciliation in Australia. So you can see up there, I'll give you a really brief overview of each one. But race relations, it's kind of exactly what it says. It's about developing stronger relationships between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and then the broader community. So it's strengthening our relationships, building stronger ties and connections. It's also very much about anti-racism and creating a society that is free of racism through those anti-racist strategies and through, I guess, engaging in conversations about racism and realistic conversations about racism. Equality and equity is about equitable approaches and ensuring that everybody has the same opportunities and gets to kind of achieve the same goals. It looks, within that is things like closing the gap. It's also looking at your own policies and procedures and things that might exist that can support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to achieve the things that they want to achieve in life and removing any of those barriers that might be in place. It's essentially different strokes for different folks. Some of us it's not that we need more things, but just different things to get to the same goals that we want. Historical acceptance is really about truth telling. It's not just looking at history, but it's looking at the wrongs that were made in our past and making amends for those. So thinking about how we can acknowledge the history that has happened in Australia in ways that are going to change the way that we move forward. And part of that acknowledgement is acknowledging the structures, the institutions, the past laws and legacies that have happened in Australia and how they continue to have an impact. Institutional integrity is really about holding institutions to account to reconciliation work. So really, when we look at institutional integrity, we think about how our own school site or early learning site can have cultural integrity and can have integrity to reconciliation. So that might be looking at things like developing a reconciliation action plan. And it's also looking at things like maybe your policies, procedures, school rules, the norms that happen within your site, social norms, all those kinds of things that can impact how an institution works. Truth telling can happen within your own institutional integrity. Does your institution understand its history and its place within Australian history? There's a lot that can happen in there. And then unity is really about, I guess, that celebration and embracing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives, knowledges, ways of being as part of a shared national identity. So rather than it sitting alongside, I guess, westernized culture, it's all one and the same. When people look at us and look at Australia, they see Aboriginal culture being shared and celebrated and more than just in the ways that we see now. So we are doing some good work, I guess, in this space when it comes to having Welcome to Country really embedded within some of our major events, major sporting events, and having things like murals so that culture and that identity is really visible within, our neighbourhoods, our community. But there is more work that can be done in that space. So just, thinking about how we can continue to have that celebration. And it's important, I think, just to be aware of these things before we go into the development of a reconciliation project, because this is almost like your framework. So the way that I'm going to go through then developing a plan or a project today is to kind of look at it in steps. So step one would then be to look at your project or to look at developing a plan with these 5 dimensions in mind as your starting point. So step one is, okay, we want to do a project on reconciliation. We want to make sure that we've got everything down that we want to do in that project. But first we need to work out, is it a reconciliation project? And where does it link in here? Is it a project that might link to unity? Maybe we want to paint a mural in collaboration with an Aboriginal artist. Maybe that's a unity that's what's going to shape our project. maybe we do want to do some anti-racism work. We want to collaborate with some, local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on what they think maybe our strategy should be in addressing racism within our school. Maybe we want to do some work on historical acceptance, and we want to support our students to understand the stolen generation. And so we might be working with a stolen generation survivor, and working in a way that's culturally safe and appropriate for them to share their knowledge and their stories and their experiences. Institutional integrity, it could be that you're going to audit policies and procedures within your site, and you want to do that in collaboration with an Aboriginal person. And so it might be, that you're looking at some sort of auditing or collaboration or partnership approach to that. And then same with equality and equity. It could be looking at school, ensuring that, your policies ensure cultural safety. It could be putting your staff through a cultural responsiveness training with an Aboriginal business or a provider. So thinking about how this almost scaffolds, this is your first step. You're just building those initial steps of, okay, this is where we're getting started, and this is going to help us with next steps. So hopefully that makes sense, because then the next step would be in the education system. We use the Narragansett Reconciliation and Education Program to develop a reconciliation action plan. And I'll talk about this in a bit more detail, but it's probably worth saying right off the bat that a reconciliation action plan that's either in development or published is going to really help you to then not only identify a project that you want to work on, but really flesh that out and make sure that your project says what it needs to say. And so if you just look at the screen, we've got what's called the required actions of a Narragansett Reconciliation Action Plan. And this is where I would say in developing a reconciliation project, this is step 2. So step 1 is kind of identifying our framework and thinking about, well, what reconciliation goals are we looking at? And then step 2 is, okay, like we've made a decision that we maybe want to do some anti-racism work. I can have a look in these required actions and see that taking action against racism is a required action, and that is something that I could then link to my project. The thing about the Narragansett website is that when you go into these actions, it gives you a whole list of ideas for action, some context that you might need. And all of that work is incredibly important when it comes to developing a project plan or putting together, I guess, your outline of a reconciliation project. And so, having these, I guess, 14 required actions in mind. Well, there's not 14, I should say. There are 14 required actions that you can choose from, but I've intentionally left some off because there are some around staff engagement of the RAP and celebrating RAP progress that I don't think necessarily relate to a project. They could. And there's a whole bunch of other Narragansett actions. There are 40 to choose from. So you may choose something else from the website as well. But I always think it's a good starting point to start with the 14 required, because those are the actions that really are the foundation for any RAP. And particularly if you haven't done a reconciliation project yet and you're looking at how you might structure one up, these are going to really help you to I guess, like form your thoughts and ideas. Whenever you choose a reconciliation action plan action, you're also required to come up with a goal and a deliverable. And so even if you've got no reconciliation action plan developed yet, I would really suggest having a look as you're starting to like maybe develop a reconciliation project, thinking about an action, a goal, and a deliverable for that action ahead of time. It's going to really support you to then again flesh out that project. And not that these kind of processes will support you with other grant applications, but specifically for the reconciliation essay grant applications, we do want to see a link to the Narragansett process. And so doing that little bit of pre-work is going to really support you. So some other, I guess, key things to think about is whenever we're looking at reconciliation projects, a lot of us can be really ambitious, which is, I have written here, is an important thing. to consider with a reconciliation project. But before you kind of go guns a-blazing, thinking about all the amazing things you could do, just start with the existing initiatives that you have. And so this is kind of the step 3. So you've kind of looked at, okay, we want to do, going back to race relations is the dimension we think we're going to focus on. We're going to use the Take Action Against Racism action. And then we're going to look at, sorry, I'm hoping that we can still, I saw that there was maybe some settings changed. So let me know if anything is going awry in the chat. So you've decided that you're going to do race relations, you're going to look at take action against racism as your action. And then the next step logically from there is to look at the existing initiatives that you might already be doing in your site in order to build on them and grow them, and maybe do some things that you haven't been able to achieve before because you've had a budget restriction. So thinking about, well, what are we already doing, or what have we discussed multiple times in our RAP working group meetings or in our team meetings, staff meetings, that we think would be great if we had some extra money and that we could do this. Then secondly is try and be ambitious and authentic. When it comes to a reconciliation project, it is really important to try and do something different, and go against the status quo and do things that maybe you just haven't been able to bring into your site before. It might be organising a welcome to country and a smoking ceremony, something that maybe your students have never seen before. But that authenticity is really important because you want to work in ways that are meaningful and that are appropriate for your site. And so that is kind of where that third piece of advice, collaboration is key, really comes in. And particularly with the reconciliation essay grants, our criteria is really clear that we want education sites to be working in collaboration with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples or businesses. But I think in general, if you're doing a meaningful reconciliation project, you will be working in some way in partnership. You will be working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community members on your project. So having that collaboration is key. I'd really suggest that you bring them in conception phase rather than when you've developed a full project. The risk of coming up with a full project idea and then ringing someone and being like, we have this idea, can you do this? Is that it brings that person in right at the end. Whereas if you bring them in at the beginning, not only do they feel like it's a true collaboration and a partnership, but also they can be really honest and open with you about what they can achieve. And it may be that you're missing out on potential possibilities of where that project could go because you've kind of put the project into a really clear box rather than allowing a bit more openness and flexibility in where it can go. I guess like one of the biggest downfalls of the grants program in the previous few years has been developing a whole project plan and an idea and then struggling to find a person that is available to do that work. Whereas if you start with the relationship first, you're going to be able to develop really good, successful projects. And it's really about building relationships and having those transformative and ongoing relationships with people. And so having that collaborative approach is going to definitely take a project from good to great. So working in partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is absolutely key in this process. I can't stress enough how important it is to walk together when it comes to this work. And I want that to be like a real takeaway from today, especially when we look at the Reconciliation South Australia grants process. That is one of our key criteria, but that kind of co-creation or conception of a grant is again going to make it so much more successful. We also found, looking at last year's grants process, that some of those really successful grants or the grants that have gone really well or are a bit more mature or a bit more ambitious than some of the other applications in the competitive process were grants where you could see that negotiation had started with, the person listed as the main contact and the main provider of the support or implementation of the grant. It happened right at the beginning, and you can see that kind of it was really clear what their project was going to be, as opposed to an application that kind of had a bunch of ideas that might happen if this person can come on board. So, you often have timeframes when grant rounds are announced, and it's really important to kind of use that time to start early with your engagement and make sure that you have somebody, you don't have to give them exact dates, but we want to do this work together, and will you be available in this rough time frame, and will you be able to do these particular things, and what do you think that we could also be doing? So, really doing a partnership approach rather than we'll tell you what we want approach. It's very transactional and it often doesn't work. So in terms of then project planning, I guess the final step, once you've worked through all of these things, is you need to have a rough kind of documented version of what you're going to do, so that then when the council announces their grants, or you get an email from the Department for Education, or the Reconciliation SA grants are released, you've got a starting point, you've got a project plan or a template that you can use. So the first thing is, like, if you haven't used anything before and you have access to it, have a little bit of a Google and just look at some project planning templates or some project planning software. So at Reconciliation SA, we do a lot of project-based work, and as a result, we use Trello is a really good free platform to use, where it's essentially a list maker or somewhere where you can add tasks that you want to do. But those kinds of programs can be really good in just helping you to really unpack, okay, we want to do this project. What are all the steps that we need to take to achieve this project? So as an example, again, going back to the anti-racism work, you've decided that you want to do a project on taking action against racism. And maybe your project is doing some consultation with an Aboriginal person on an anti-racism strategy for the school. So if you were going to develop an anti-racism strategy, it's good to just plot out all the things that you might need to do when it comes to that work. So for example, it might be that you want to do some consultation with students, you want to talk individually to students and hear their ideas, you want to organise, a session where an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander business does some consultancy work and looks at your current policies and procedures and what, maybe anti-racism work is already happening in the school, and they might provide advice on what you can add. There's all kinds of things that you can kind of put in this format, and you want to just have it all separated and I guess in a tasky format, so that you know how much a project is going to cost. Then you want to do a bit of a summary. So, what is our big kind of bold reconciliation project? It could be something simple, like maybe you want to do a reconciliation garden. And so it's good to kind of summarize what it is we want to do and why do we want to do this and how are we going to achieve it and who's going to benefit, just some short, kind of snappy, no more than a couple of paragraphs about what the project's going to be about. But when you're doing that, it's also really important to be really clear on what are the outcomes that you want to see from a project. I think sometimes we get a bit excited about things that other sites are doing and we want to give that a go in our site. And it's good to, again, go back a couple of steps and think about, well, what do we actually want to achieve? And what reconciliation work are we having trouble achieving? And a bit of a budget, an extra budget, or a really targeted project planning approach could help us to get that done. So, like, for example, your outcomes could be what do we want the students to get out of it? What do we want the teachers to get out of it? What do we want our local community to get out of it? And what sorts of things is this going to benefit our reconciliation action plan? So just thinking about that, which leads me really nicely to then who benefits. So, we're thinking about the outcomes and who's going to be benefited by those outcomes? Who's going to get something out of these projects? Is it your students? Is it their families? Is it your local community? Who is in your sphere of influence? that's really going to be engaged in this work and get excited about the project and potentially change hearts and minds as a result of, you know, participating in either the development of the project or the implementation, or just viewing whatever you've kind of created as a result, whether it's a mural or a garden or something much bigger. So, you know, thinking through those things. It's always really important to identify early on who are you going to work with. So, you know, identifying some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander owned businesses or people, you know, having a bit of a Google is really easy. You'll find a bunch of names of cultural consultants and people who can work with schools. If you want more information about where to find people and who they are, you can send me an email after this and I can send you a few links. We have some organisations that exist in Adelaide that, you know, keep lists and names of Aboriginal owned businesses that do a lot of different things. So, you know, just keeping in mind that you can get in contact with me for that information. It'll take a bit too long to go through today. So it's also really important to really project what this project is going to cost you, and also where you can save some money with things like in-kind support. So obviously you're going to find out who you want to work with, and as you start negotiating who you want to work with, you'll very quickly determine what their fees are and what their structure is and how much they need to be remunerated. But in a grant application process, like, a lot of them want to see what in-kind support you can provide as well. And for those that don't know, that's really anything that you can provide in some sort of volunteer capacity or some sort of way within your own site that may not be directly like exchanging of cash. And so things like, if you were going to do, again, going back to that reconciliation garden idea, if you wanted to develop a small reconciliation garden within your site, then you may want to put most of a successful grant funding towards working with an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person to help you understand what to plant in there, how to use those plants, how to teach children and young people about what you've planted, how to maybe cook with it, what can be used like to make like perfumes or medicine, and what can be used to cook with and eat and enjoy. And you know, that's a really good use of your money. But then you might also be able to provide a lot of in-kind support for a project like that by, you know, getting a working bee together with some families and some teachers and digging out those garden beds, or contacting a local hardware store or a Bunnings and saying, can you provide some garden beds or our seedlings for free? You know, like, those kinds of negotiations can really bring a grant to a more successful place if you can think about all those in-kind supports that you can put in as well. And then the final thing, which I think a lot of people genuinely forget about because they get so excited when they see the initial grant, that they forget to go back and really make sure that they're addressing the grant criteria. So the reconciliation SA grants are going to have really different criteria to a council grant, to a Green Adelaide grant, to like a community engagement grant. You know, each of them are going to have their own outcomes that they are trying to achieve through their grants program as well. So make sure that the grant that you're applying for is addressing that grant criteria. And there are things like providing in-kind support that need to be put into place for grants a lot of the time, and being super clear with how much money you're going to spend and on what and where their grant money is going to go. Generally, the higher the grant or the larger the amount of money, the more, I guess, financial acquitting you're going to need to do. So be really clear. The best suggestion I can make is always have the grant criteria open while you're developing your grant application. But in terms of the reconciliation South Australia grants, you will be happy to know that they are pretty easy, and we don't ask for a lot of that information anymore. We have tried to simplify the process as much as possible, because we want the projects to speak for themselves, and we don't do a lot of financial acquitting, but we want to see evidence that you implemented a project. And I'll talk a bit more about that. But what I will say is that Our grants are going to launch at the beginning of term 2. So week 1 next term, we will launch them. If you are not following Reconciliation SA on any of our social media, or if you're not on the current education distribution list for the newsletter, I really suggest that you get on board, because that is where we make all our announcements of any other upcoming events, and also where a lot of our reconciliation grants, information will come out. So they'll launch in term 2. It's a competitive process, which means that we will receive all the grants between that week 1 and the end of term 2. So we close them in that final week of term 2, and then we will assess all the applications against each other in the school holiday break. So you have, I can't remember how many weeks are in term 2 off the top of my head, but you have like around about 10 weeks to start and finish a grant application. So just keep in mind, you've got a fair bit of time, but they will be competitive, and I'll go through the criteria because it's really important for you to understand what we're going to be assessing the grants against. Applicants will be notified of whether they were successful or not in term 3. So we make a point of ensuring that all of our grant applications have been properly assessed and our applicants notified after the school holidays. So you will get a notification fairly quickly. And then from that point, you have 12 months to implement your grant project, and it needs to be acquitted by, the same time in the following year. So when it will have a date on your application of when you need to acquit that. So our reconciliation grants are intended predominantly to resource schools and early learning sites to engage with their local and broader Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. So we have had a lot of feedback over the last few years that schools struggle to, begin relationships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and struggle with some of the actions like build relationships with community and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the classroom. And so what we've done here is we've really tried to create a grants program that will allow you to have some money to get started in building a relationship with a business or a person who can come in and support particular initiatives that you want to work on. The project that you come up with for Reconciliation SA has to engage and remunerate First Nations peoples or businesses in ways where you can do consultation, where you can deepen existing work, or you can provide ongoing learning to your students, to your teachers as part of the project. So last year, we saw over 80% of our grants funding came through out to schools, and then schools paid that to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So that's really amazing economic reconciliation, and it's really something we're really proud of in the grants program that we want to see continue. And so we really want to see those partnership approaches and those ways in which we're really engaging in as transformational ways as we can. We do want sites that are applying to have a public reconciliation action plan on the Narragansett website. And if you do have a public RAP and you apply for the grant, you will be meeting more criteria than those that you're competing against. So you have a much better shot of having a successful application if you do have that public RAP. However, we also want to make sure that people have time to develop their RAP, and RAPs go out of date every 12 months, and there are a bunch of circumstances in place where your RAP might not be public. So we do also take into account that you may be working on one, or you may be in the development stage, and we just need to see really clear steps on how you're going to get a public RAP within that 12-month acquittal process. So we had about 50-50 sites that had public RAPs and sites who are working on RAPs in the last grant round. But again, you're finding out really about the grants now, so you can start preparing by making sure that your reconciliation action plan is up to date on Narragansett, or that you're in the process of starting one, that you've got some initial steps in place, so that when you're developing your project, that you can really clearly show, yeah, we are working on our RAP at the moment. We also really prioritize sustainable projects. So when we're talking about sustainability, we're not talking about environmental sustainability. We're talking about projects that have longevity, that are going to be able to be, kind of embedded within the school culture over long periods of time. So as an example, again, I guess going back to the reconciliation garden example, if you were to put a reconciliation garden in, the project's going to be prioritized if, for example, you can show that some resources might be developed, that you're going to be able to support other teachers to know how to look after it and how to continue replenishing it and rejuvenating it, that it's going to be maybe a project where you have someone who supports you to understand how to use that garden over a long period of time. So they may be coming back in and out of the site multiple times over the project. And we can see, yeah, this is going to be a garden that lasts and not a garden that maybe withers away and dies within a few weeks of planting it because we didn't, tell any other teachers how to look after it. We all went on school holidays and it didn't get watered. So, we want to see those sustainability processes in place where things are being looked after, things are being cared for, and there are other ways in which the project can keep going outside of when the money's been spent. So, there's policies or there's documents that support it. There's been education across teams. The students have ownership, whatever it might be. And that's kind of links to that longevity as well. Sometimes it might not be something that's embedded or sustainable, but it might have longevity because it might be something that is going to last forever. Like it could be a mural, or it could be a space that you build or something that you put together that's really going to, be in the school and show people a visible commitment to the school, to reconciliation in the school or early learning site. Things as well like a walking trail we've seen, and also like development of curriculum resources have longevity where they might sit in the school for long periods of time. They could go out of date with changes to the curriculum, but those kinds of things can be really supportive in helping people to embed reconciliation work within their planning and their teaching as well. And then transformational, I should say, projects don't need to be all three of these things. So they can be one of each. We're not necessarily ticking all three boxes. And in some cases, something might be really transformational, but it might not necessarily be something that's sustainable or embedded within your site for a little while. So an example of that could be maybe engaging someone to come to one of your significant days and doing a welcome to country. So maybe at sports day, you might get someone to come and do a welcome to country. And while that may not be something that you can do every term or every significant event, it depends on your school budget, that's still really transformational and really transformative, particularly for children and young people who may have never seen that process before or never participated in something where there's maybe a smoking ceremony or cultural dance or like someone playing the yidaki. These things can be really transformative even if they are a once-off. And so we want to be clear that we're looking for maybe it having one of those qualities. If it has all three, that's incredible and good work. But we want to make it a simple process. And we do want projects to be aspirational and innovative. So I'll go through some of the successful applications that we've had on the next slide. But, aspirational and innovative projects or things that show real maturity in the school or early learning sites, growth and understanding of reconciliation are also going to be prioritised. So things like it might be, we do see a lot of mural projects and we do see a lot of reconciliation garden projects. And so we want to just see a more innovative approach to maybe some of those things, or maybe stepping outside of that and thinking about, well, how do we embed some of these reconciliation goals and deliverables that we want to achieve? Or how do we support student learning in more active and interesting ways in reconciliation work? So it's really about being a bit more creative and also not necessarily just doing a cookie cutter of, I looked online and here was 5 ideas for reconciliation projects, or I saw that a bunch of other schools have done this. Like really thinking about your own context and what's going to work for your school or your early learning site as well. And so some examples that we've seen that I think probably fit that bill or hopefully can provide a bit of inspiration for you as well is we've seen a few projects of people using a tree in their space to create a scar tree and cut a garner shield from their tree, or they might cut other items. And so this is a really great cultural experience, a really great way, if you're on Kaurna country, for people to see Kaurna culture in action. And this links so nicely to things like woodwork, to science, to environmental sustainability. I'm still honestly baffled every time about how we can put a tree through trauma and take from it and then also care for it enough that it can kind of come back from that and continue surviving, and we've been able to use what we need while still keeping this thing alive. It's unbelievable to me. It's a really incredible piece of Kaurna culture that I've learned about and really enjoyed learning about. We've also seen like a lot of events, so using the grants as an opportunity to maybe pay a guest speaker or someone to come and talk to people, and to do that in a way where as many people as possible in their school community get to engage with that as a result. So like a community yarning circle was one of the ways that a school brought together some guest speakers and did like a reconciliation kind of yarn and session where families, students, other members of their community could all come along, have a bit of a shared meal, and spend some time together. We also saw up in a school on Paramount Country, they did something called Yanun Evenings with a local community member and knowledge holder to learn a bit more about Paramount Country, watch like some yidaki playing and had a campfire, some shared food. These are really like wonderful ways, I think, of engaging people in conversation and building knowledge and capacity of staff to understand reconciliation concepts and build on those. And these kind of informal experiences are still really fulfilling and really supportive of learning. We've seen some sites do like some school house designs, so changing, the images or the names of their schoolhouses from like typically colonial names to things that are more appropriate and more respectful in acknowledging the traditional country that we're on. And so, those are some really great kind of mature and original ways of thinking. We've also seen like walking trails be developed within interpretive signage so that, we can learn a little bit more about maybe significant sites within our local communities, and we can build more permanent spaces that help people to understand a bit more about where our sites sit and how they are part of this bigger tapestry of history. We've seen sites do curriculum audits. These are a really wonderful way of working to create, sustainable and long-term documents where, this was actually an out-of-school hours care site, worked with some Aboriginal consultants to look at their curriculum and what they'd been doing and develop new curriculum that better embedded Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives within what they were doing in OSH. And that is, I think, I don't know if there's anybody attending today from out of school hours care, but maybe they'll watch the recording of this video. But out of school hours care is like a messy space when it comes to designing your own programming and planning. And so having that expertise of an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person to support you in embedding those perspectives within like traditionally kind of recreational activities can be incredibly supportive and again have that transformative quality in the ways in which you implement your program. The Jabruki Trail and Learning of Work is something that happened in, I think, the first or second year of our grants program, and one of our sites actually worked collaboratively with Southern Cultural Immersion and the Kaurna Living Culture Centre to come up with some really clear, concise units of work that they could then continue to use over the years to take their students on the Jabruki walking trail and learn about the Jabruki dreaming story. So that's a really brilliant way of using, some grants funding to put something together that is going to be there for you to use for a really long time, and for students to kind of have a consistent experience where every year when this group of students go to year 5, they're going to participate in, their teachers all have this unit of work, and they're going to be able to participate in those excursions, and it's going to become a part of the school culture that they learn these kind of Ghana knowledges and histories in really culturally appropriate ways that have been vetted and supported by, appropriate organizations. And then finally, we supported a school with their Wakakuri performance so that they could do really appropriate consultation with elders. And so their project kind of is a big one in terms of, doing this anti-racism performance with Wakakuri, but they could then use funding to, have conversations with people in their community and make sure that what they were doing was not only appropriate, but also was representative of what people wanted to see. So these, I think, are all really great projects, and there's lots more that are also really good, but it would take me an hour just to go through all of them. But yeah, these just give you like a bit of a sense of what sorts of things are going to be successful or what you could work on, but also don't necessarily look at these and try and cut and paste them for your site. You may have much better ideas, and that's fine. The other thing I will say, in all of these grants conversations and all of this kind of back and forth about how to do a grant, you can always get in contact with me. I am busy and I don't always get back to emails straight away. But if you have questions about grants, or you want me to have a look at a project or a proposal or an idea that you're thinking, I'm always happy to have a look at that and, give you some advice. And if you're working on reconciliation action plans, the Narragansett website is also going to really help you to be able to develop a good project, because they do have lots of ideas, curriculum resources, all kinds of things on there that can maybe help you to think a bit more deeply about this too. So kind of final tips and tricks before we get to questions is contact who you want to work with as soon as you can and start planning the project together. So, if you want it to be really good and mature, like the best way for that to happen is to bring in, the relationships that you have with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, or start building them. And you can build them through working on a project. Like, what are we going to do together? And what would you like to see our site do? And this is what we would like our students to learn, and you'll be able to come up with something pretty amazing. The grants will be available in term 2, so don't panic, don't rush your application. You've got weeks to do it, but I know, especially if you're working in sites where it's hard to get release time to do this work, you might be only given a small period of time to have a look at it, but try and make sure that you give yourself enough time and that you don't rush through it in the last week that they're due, because you will have the opportunity to make sure that you've got people listed on your application, that you've done your costing effectively. So if your school is looking at doing a grant, like really, encourage them to prioritize this as something that, you could potentially be getting $2,000 to do a really cool project. And so if you can't put aside the time to write the application, then chances are you also can't put aside the time to implement the project. So, making sure that you've set, I guess, the standard of how things are going to be straight away. Use it as an opportunity to try something new or do something different. There are lots of kind of tried and true projects, and that might work for your context, but there's also, these are great opportunities to get creative and think about something that's going to be really unique and special for your students, your families, or your staff members. Having a reconciliation action plan is going to make this application process much easier on you. So just keep that in mind. I mean, you can literally start tomorrow if you are wanting to apply for our grants. I would go and have a look at what your Narragansett wrap looks like at the moment. Do you need to review it, refresh it? Have you got one? If you don't, maybe it's time to get started. You can get in contact with me. We will have a bunch of reconciliation workshops happening throughout the year. So there's going to be plenty of opportunities for you to learn about reconciliation action plan development if you don't have something yet. But, you know, it doesn't take long to go and log in and get started on a wrap. And finally, keep all that grant criteria in mind that I talked to you about. We also, when we release the grants and launch the grants, there'll be info sheets and there will be the grant criteria there for you to look at. So don't just look at what you want to achieve, but also look at what our grant criteria wants to see in those applications as well. All right. So that's it from me. I guess the best thing to do from here is throw to any questions, any comments. We'll finish up at 6, so we've got 8 minutes to really go through. If there's any kind of burning things that you want to talk about when it comes to grants, go for it. You can use the chat box if you're not confident to take yourself off mute. I'll put my contact email in the chat box for anybody that doesn't have it and would like to get in contact. The best way to get in contact with me is to email me. I do have a phone number that's available for you to look at on the Reconciliation SA website. But please get in contact with me via email and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. The other thing I would say that's really a great way of keeping in contact with me is to, if you haven't, send me an email to sign up for the education newsletter. So we offer a quarterly education newsletter with everything that we're kind of getting up to. And that's always a really good way to just know if there's any free events or anything like that coming up. So, well, if there's no more questions, I'm going to end the webinar here. Thank you, everybody, for attending and learning a bit more about reconciliation projects. And I hope you have a go and be brave in putting together a really interesting grant. And keep in touch with me even if you're not applying for our specific grants program. Love to hear what sort of reconciliation work is happening out in the sector. So get in touch. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. See you later.